When we think of ancient Egypt, our minds conjure images of golden masks, towering pyramids, and powerful pharaohs. But what about the vast majority of Egyptians who never wore a crown or rested in a gilded tomb? What was it like to wake up as an ordinary person along the Nile 3,000 years ago? Today, we're stepping away from the monuments and into the homes, workshops, and fields where real Egyptians lived, worked, and dreamed. The rhythm of Egyptian life followed the Nile's annual cycle with absolute devotion. The river wasn't just water. It was life itself, a god named Hapi who brought fertility or famine depending on his mood. Every summer, Egyptians watched anxiously as the river rose, transforming their world into a vast lake. Too little water meant hunger. Too much meant destruction. But when the flood was just right, it left behind a gift of rich black silt that would feed the nation for another year. Most Egyptians were farmers, their lives governed by 3 seasons that had nothing to do with our modern calendar. Akhe, the inundation season, arrived when fields disappeared under water. This was when farmers were conscripted for royal building projects. Those pyramids didn't build themselves. Parat, the growing season, began when waters receded and the real work started. Plowing, planting, and praying to the gods for a good harvest. Finally came Shimu, the harvest season, when entire communities worked frantically to gather crops before the scorching heat turned everything to dust. Let's walk through a typical farming village at dawn. Homes were made of mud brick, Nile mud mixed with straw and baked under the relentless sun. These weren't the stone monuments we see in museums. Those were reserved for gods and the dead. The living made do with simpler materials. Most houses had flat roofs where families slept during hot nights, catching whatever breeze might offer relief from the heat that could reach well over 40 degrees Celsius. Inside these modest homes, furniture was sparse but functional. Wealthy families might have wooden beds and chairs, but most people sat on mats and slept on raised platforms. The headrest, that strange curved wooden pillow we see in museums, actually made sense in Egyptian heat. It kept your head elevated and cool, preventing scorpions from crawling into your hair, and preserved elaborate hairstyles that took hours to arrange. Speaking of hair, Egyptians had complex relationships with it. Many shaved their heads completely and wore wigs made from human hair, sheep's wool, or plant fibers. This wasn't vanity, it was practical hygiene in a climate where lice and heat were constant enemies. Children often had their heads shaved except for a distinctive sidelock that marked their youth. Both men and women wore makeup not just for beauty but for protection. The famous black kohl eyeliner reduced sun glare and had antibacterial properties that protected against eye infections common in the dusty environment. Let's talk about work because that consumed most of an Egyptian's waking hours. Beyond farming, Egyptian society needed craftsmen of every kind. Potters shaped clay for everything from storage jars to cosmetic containers. Weavers transformed flax into linen, Egypt's most important fabric, sitting for hours at looms, their fingers dancing across threads. Linen quality varied enormously. Coarse cloth for workers, fabric so fine it was nearly transparent for the elite. Bakers worked from before dawn, because bread was the foundation of the Egyptian diet. They mixed emmer wheat flour with water, sometimes adding dates or honey, and baked in clay ovens that reached intense temperatures. Bread came in dozens of shapes and varieties. Some excavated loaves are still recognizable after 3 millennia. Beer was equally essential, brewed from partially baked bread dissolved in water and left to ferment. This wasn't the beer we know today, it was thick, nutritious, and often safer to drink than water. Children drank it, workers received it as payment. Offerings included it for the gods and the dead. Payment itself reveals fascinating insights into daily economics. Egypt didn't use coins during most of its ancient history. Instead, they operated on a barter system with standardized values. A deben was a unit of weight, about 91 grams of copper or silver, used to calculate worth. A goat might be worth 1 deben. A donkey, 20 deben. Workers were paid in rations, grain, beer, oil, occasionally meat. The famous workers' village at Deir el-Medina, where artisans who built royal tombs lived, has left us detailed records of strikes when rations arrived late. Yes, labor strikes existed in ancient Egypt, proving that some aspects of worker-employer tensions are truly timeless. Women in ancient Egypt enjoyed rights that would shock their counterparts in Greece or Rome centuries later. They could own property, inherit wealth, initiate divorce, and run businesses. Many worked as weavers, brewers, musicians, and dancers. Some became priestesses, though the most powerful religious positions were reserved for men. In legal documents, women appear buying and selling land, taking legal action, and managing estates. This doesn't mean Egypt was gender equal by modern standards, it wasn't, but women had legal standing that was remarkably progressive for the ancient world. Family life centered around children, who were cherished and celebrated. Infant mortality was tragically high, so those who survived were protected with amulets, spells, and the constant attention of extended family. Children played with dolls, balls, toy animals with moving parts, and board games like Senet, a game so popular that sets have been found in tombs so the dead could play in the afterlife. Education for most children meant learning the family trade through apprenticeship. Only a tiny percentage, mostly boys from elite families, learned to read and write, a skill that could elevate someone to the privileged scribal class. Scribes were the bureaucrats who kept Egypt functioning. They recorded everything: tax assessments, grain stores, legal disputes, letters, religious texts. Their training was rigorous, beginning as young as 5 years old. Students copied classic texts repeatedly, memorizing hundreds of hieroglyphic and hieratic signs. The profession was respected and relatively comfortable. Scribes worked indoors, avoided hard labor, and could rise to positions of real power. Statues of scribes often show them with soft bellies, a visual boast that they didn't do physical work. Religion permeated every aspect of daily life in ways that modern secular societies might find difficult to comprehend. Egyptians didn't separate sacred from mundane. The gods were everywhere, involved in everything. Each home had a shrine to household deities like Bes, the dwarf god who protected children and childbirth, or Taret, the hippo goddess who safeguarded mothers. Before eating, working, or traveling, Egyptians might say prayers or make small offerings. The calendar was filled with festivals that broke the monotony of agricultural labor. During the beautiful festival of the valley, families visited the tombs of their ancestors, bringing food, drink, and flowers. They ate meals at the burial site, telling stories about the deceased, maintaining connections between living and dead. The Opet festival in Thebes lasted for weeks, with processions, feasting, and the rare opportunity for commoners to see the sacred statues of gods carried by priests. These weren't solemn occasions. They were celebrations with music, dancing, and beer flowing freely. Medicine and magic were inseparable in Egyptian healthcare. When someone fell ill, treatment combined practical remedies with magical incantations. Egyptian doctors were surprisingly advanced. They could set broken bones, perform surgery, and had extensive knowledge of herbal medicines. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text from around 1600 BCE, describes surgical procedures with systematic observations that seem remarkably modern. But the same doctors who expertly treated wounds also prescribed spells and amulets, because they understood illness as having both physical and spiritual dimensions. Death was never far from Egyptian consciousness, but not in a morbid way. Preparing for the afterlife was practical planning. Wealthy families mummified their dead and filled tombs with goods, but ordinary Egyptians did what they could afford. Simple burials with a few possessions, protective amulets, maybe a shabby figure to do work in the afterlife. The democratization of afterlife beliefs during the Middle Kingdom meant that paradise wasn't just for pharaohs anymore. Anyone who lived a good life and passed the judgment of Osiris could reach the field of reeds, an idealized version of Egypt where crops grew effortlessly and no one ever went hungry. The lives of ancient Egyptians were filled with the same fundamental concerns that occupy us today. Putting food on the table, protecting family, finding meaning in work, connecting with something larger than ourselves. They laughed, loved, argued, celebrated, and mourned. They took pride in skilled work, found joy in festivals, and worried about harvests and taxes. The pyramids and temples stand as monuments to pharaohs, but the real legacy of Egypt is something more humble and profound. The evidence that human beings 3,000 years ago weren't fundamentally different from us. They lived with hope and fear, built communities, raised children, and tried to make sense of their place in the universe. Their everyday lives, preserved in tomb paintings, letters, and archaeological remains, remind us that history isn't just made by kings and conquerors. It's made by ordinary people living ordinary lives with extraordinary dignity. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the daily lives of ancient Egyptians, subscribe to Trail of Shards for more stories from the ancient world that go beyond the monuments and into the hearts of the people who built them. Hit that like button if you found something that surprised you about Egyptian daily life. Until next time, keep exploring the human stories behind the history.